Good evening. Oh, turn off your cell phones, I just remembered. Good evening. I'm Gadi Levy, Executive Director of the Temple Emanu-El Streicker Cultural Center, and I'm proud to welcome all of you who are here in person, those who are joining us virtually from all over the world, and especially tonight's esteemed guest. As Jews, we recognize the power of history and the act of remembering as the glue that holds our people together. Doing so is central to the mission at the Streicker Center, and this evening's program, held just 1 week after the anniversary of Leil Abdullah, Kristallnacht, advances that goal. While listening to stories from those who survived Nazi death camps, watching films, and visiting Auschwitz, we all have asked ourselves whether we could have survived those horrific conditions and how the few who did manage that miracle. The answers usually come down to faith, prayer, community, and above all, memory. Among the memories that sustained the Jews slated for death were flashbacks to enormous Shabbat dinners served on white tablecloths, to the aroma of freshly baked challah, to the sight of mothers rolling dough for strudel, and the taste of tradition that is matzah ball. These recollections kept survivors connected to the world, to the people and culture they had lost, and fed their will to survive. The Auschwitz Birkenau Memorial Foundation has recently released an extraordinary collection of recipes for the food to which those prisoners clung, that they cooked after liberation to restore the wasted body and souls, that they passed to the children so they too will not forget. Tonight, we are honored to welcome 4 special men and women whose memories are included in his amazing book of hope and triumph of the human story. To introduce them and our moderator, actually, I will ask all of them to come back on the stage at the same time, and to introduce them and our moderator, it is my great pleasure to welcome on the stage a man who has shown unparalleled commitment to Jewish communal life, Ronald S. Lauder, President of the World Jewish Congress and Chairman of the Auschwitz Birkenau Memorial Foundation, which published the cookbook we are discussing today. Friends, please welcome all of our esteemed guests.
You've just heard the first Israeli to say my last name correctly. Every Israeli calls me Lauder.
I practice.
Hey. Thank you. Now, if someone had told me when I was growing up that I'd be the head of the World Jewish Congress or any Jewish organization, I would have told them they must be drinking. But now that I'm there to head the World Jewish Congress, I never thought I'd be introducing a cookbook. Let me tell you how this cookbook came about and how special it is for not only the survivors, but people, Jewish people all over. When I was going to the 75th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz in January, 3 years ago, I guess it is now, what happened is I felt that this may be the last chance for survivors to see Auschwitz. So I invited 120 survivors and their families to come to Auschwitz. There's approximately between 450 and 500. Kept changing. But the fact is that the night before, we had a dinner for all 450, and it was a special evening. We all sat there, and we had also the head of Ukraine, President Zelensky, there. And it was a very special evening. Halfway through the evening, I was asking somebody, because I've always tried to find a great gefilte fish recipe. Now, every gefilte fish recipe I've seen in the past was either a modern version, which had no resemblance to the gefilte fish I remembered, or an old version that took a pinch of this, and you take the fish, and you cut the head off. I was trying to find an easy gefilte fish recipe. Now, to ask 120 survivors a gefilte fish recipe, you got 300 answers. But as I was speaking to them, everyone was telling me about different recipes from their mother or grandmother. And I began to realize that the memories they had of their home was not memories just of how it looked, but very much about what their mother or grandmother made, particularly on holidays. And I was speaking to them, and I also heard that very often this is one of the things they talked about when they were together, and the memories. And they always were talking about different things. So we came up with the idea of having recipes and eventually maybe a cookbook. But I didn't know how possible it was. And where's Maria? Maria? She is one of the founders of the cookbook. She had the job of turning all these recipes into normal recipes. Impossible, but it happened. But slowly but surely, we used to have Zoom calls of all the survivors, and we were speaking to them. And each one of the Zoom calls was mainly a call also about recipes. So finally, we had a name for the cookbook: Auschwitz Recipes. It's second only to the movie Springtime for Hitler. But fabulous, these recipes were fabulous. So we looked around and we came up with Honey Cakes and Latkes, this book. And what we did is we turned around and everyone submitted recipes. We had 27 gefilte fish, but we did have very interesting recipes. And we got together, how many recipes? 110 different recipes. And we had them make each one of them. And frankly, I tried many of them myself. The only one I didn't like was the matzah brie, because when you put boiling water on top of the matzah turns to soup. So it wasn't matzah brie. So I had to make changes. But the people who made it knew how to do it. But frankly, these recipes were part of a life that passed. And these recipes were all made that left of a whole civilization that grew up, and the parents, the mothers who made this for their children or their grandchildren. And frankly, they remember very, very much. Elie Wiesel was one of the survivors who unfortunately passed away before this was done. But he had a recipe for latkes and potato pancakes, for those who don't know. There must be one person here that doesn't know it. But frankly, it was different than any one I ever had because he hated onions. So it was made without onions. It was cooked in a very special way. I spoke to Maria Zalewska, his widow, and I got her to give the recipe. Wasn't easy, but frankly, it's very special. And the honey cakes, let me tell you, are great. They're not dietetic, but they are absolutely fantastic. And we also had pictures of them being made in the studio. And interesting, several of the survivors had their picture taken and shortly afterwards passed away. But what's there was the recipes. And to go through these recipes and see what it is, you're getting a touch of what Jewish life was like for families at that time. We can't reproduce what it looked like, what the towns looked like, or the villages, or even the synagogues. We then taste the recipes, and it brings back memories. And again, for the survivors, you'll hear about them in a few minutes. These survivors are fantastic. They have energy that's unbelievable. And when I had 120 of them there, it was like having 500 people together. They had great energy and great stories and a great spirit. And none of them had any hate. They were all people who survived because they had a feeling for life, but also because of the fact they had something to hold on to. And one of the things they held on to was their memories and memories of the food. And I must tell you, it was an honor getting to know them and working with them because each one is very, very special. I will say each one is a character. You'll see it in a few minutes. But I would like to introduce them. How would I like? Tova Friedman is here. Raise your hand. That's you. And you'll tell about what you cook with. Rosalie Simon. Michael Bornstein. And Eugene Ginter. And the metro on scène, Maria Zalewska. Is that right? Because W is pronounced V. It was Maria, who was the editor-in-chief and chief cook. She's not a cook, but she is the one who will be moderating tonight's conversation. And I must tell you, you'll find them, by the way, give them a chance, you'll be here till midnight. They all have great stories to tell, and they're unique people. And I must tell you, getting to know them and the other 116 survivors was something I'll never forget. They were great human beings, and I was honored to be the chairman of Auschwitz Birkenau Foundation. It was done as a labor of love. And for those of you who have not been to Auschwitz, it's a place I think you should go. And if you can, bring your children. If you don't have children, bring your parents. But it's something to see. And because of people like this, we have a better idea what happened. We are now fighting a very difficult fight of anti-Semitism throughout the world. And interesting enough, anyone who's ever been to Auschwitz and saw what happened becomes understanding and cannot be an anti-Semite. After World War II, when people saw the pictures of the camps and what happened, nobody in the right mind wanted to be associated with the Nazis. We are now 3 and 4 generations since then, and the majority of children, even Jewish children, don't really know about what happened in Auschwitz or what happened during the Holocaust. And when you ask today children to name one concentration camp, they can't. What we're working on now is a movie that will be shown about what happened in all schools throughout the United States. And when we have the movie done, we are trying now to put it in the school system. It won't be easy. And one of the producers is behind me somewhere, hiding. But frankly, I ask you all, in many ways, this can take the place, but it does give you, and hopefully your children, hopefully friends, to buy the book and start making these recipes. Now, I also believe that some Jewish food probably have killed more Jews than anything. But frankly, it may be worth it. God bless you all, and thank you for coming tonight. And those on screen, thank you for watching. God bless you all. And this is the book. Thank you all. It's all yours. Dziękuję bardzo.
Good evening, everyone. First, I want to express our gratitude to the Streicker Center for hosting this incredible event. It's so nice to see many familiar faces in the audience. I see some board members of the Auschwitz Birkenau Memorial Foundation that published this book. It's really nice to see you all. And of course, thanks to our guests of honor, Tova, Rosalie, Michael, and Eugene, for being us tonight and for bringing your families. Over the years, we have had many chats. We've talked.
Can I sit next to you?
Yes.
So I could hear better?
Are you okay switching seats? Yeah, of course. Let's do it.
Thank you.
So over the years, I've had an honor of having many conversations with all of you. We've talked, in the comfort of your kitchens. We talked on Zoom. We've attended some events together. We went to Auschwitz together, but we've never shared a stage together. So this is new. But let's have one of our usual chats tonight. And I wanted to start with you, Rosalie.
Okay.
Because I wanted us to start chatting about the pre-Holocaust world. For Tova, for Michael, and for Eugene, war was childhood. And for you, you have memories of the pre-war world.
Yes.
Yes, so you were born in 1931 in
Yes.
what was at the time Czechoslovakia.
Yes.
And the two recipes you shared with us for the cookbook was typical Shabbat lunch meals, the chopped liver and cholent.
Yes.
Yes, and I would like to ask you to take us back to that time and the traditions around cooking those two meals. You had 4 sisters. You were the youngest sister. I was wondering who was the boss in the kitchen? Was it your mom who was cooking? Was it your sisters who taught you to cook?
My mom was the boss. She oversaw the whole kitchen. And one of my older sisters, who was Charlotte, she was 7 years older than I was, and she helped my mom. And Helen, who is the oldest sister, and Lenka, who is the 3rd sister, after the war, they took a designing course. So in order to make a living later on, so they didn't get involved in cooking too much, but Charlotte and my mother were the main two people in the kitchen. And if I wanted to watch, I watched, and if I didn't want to watch, I didn't watch.
Did you?
I did.
Yes.
Sometimes I did. But at the age of 8 or 9, I wasn't really that interested. But I did watch, and I learned a lot of things. I learned how she made the cholent. I learned how to make the chopped liver, and chicken soup, and we didn't make matzo balls then, but we had made noodles. And my mother was doing the noodles from scratch because there were no noodles to be bought. So she did everything by hand.
And who took the cholent to the...
I took the cholent.
You took, yeah.
I took the cholent, that was my job, and to pick it up was my job. And we enjoyed it very much.
Can you explain to everybody? I just want to...
Explain the cholent?
Did you get a ticket? What was the...
I recognized our pots.
Okay.
I didn't need a ticket. We recognized our pots.
Yeah, because David Lenga, who also provided one of the recipes and grew up in Łódź, he was telling us about the tickets. There were so many pots, so...
Yeah. Okay. Anyway, if you want to know how to make cholent, it's in the book. And if you want to know how to make chopped liver, it's in the book. And many other delicious recipes are in the book. And it's really worthwhile to get it. My recommendation.
Thank you. Tova, you were born 1 week after World War II began. Germany invaded Poland September 1st, 1939, and you were born September 7th. And you and Michael, who's sitting next to you, you're two of the youngest survivors of Auschwitz. And as I mentioned earlier, your childhood, war was your childhood. You don't have any memories, pre-war memories. I want to talk to you about your memories of Auschwitz and the war, but I want to start with a more general question, and it's something you and I have discussed for a couple of months now. I wonder if you could share with us what do you think is the importance of food to the process of remembering, and what does food mean to survivors? It's a conflicted topic. It's difficult, and the cookbook begins with Ambassador Lauder's words that kind of emphasize. He mentions the taboo around thinking about food in the context of Auschwitz survivors. It's not an easy topic. It's sort of this book breaks many taboos in that sense. But what do you think is the importance of food and cooking to the process of remembrance?
Okay, well, I wasn't lucky to know anything about before the war, not about food, not about people, not about school, because I was born into the war. And my memories are, of course, at the age of 2 and 3, it was war until the age of 6 and a half. Now, many of you know that one of the worst thing about people like myself is the memory of hunger. There was a kind of hunger that you cannot describe it. There is no description of what it means to be hungry. So in Auschwitz, at the age of 5 and a half, without my mother, without my father, I was in a children's barrack. I had this dream, and I still remember it because it was so memorable. I dreamt that I was swimming in egg yolks. Now, I don't understand because I don't remember tasting an egg, but I must have, in a ghetto, had one egg somewhere. It had such a memorable thing to me that when I woke up, I thought I was with my mother. Because, it's not the food. This is what's so great about this book. It isn't the food. You can get recipes anywhere. You can get better recipes because these were very simple recipes made in very simple times. But it's the people. It's the connection you have with the people. So the eggs to this day are my mother. because she gave it, I don't know how she got the egg, but she did it with love. And another thing which I remember is bread, of course. In Auschwitz, we got that little, twice a day, if you remember, that little bread. And when I was still with my mother, not before I was taken away, she would give me a piece of her bread. Now, I never understood why she didn't want to eat it. She kept saying she's tired, she doesn't need it, she isn't hungry. I was starving on 2 pieces of my portion and her portion, so that she, and I'm still thinking about bread was a feeling of life. Without bread, you die. It was the only thing we really had. So it meant life. At one time, when I was alone, taken away from her, I was in this kinder barrack, and I got a package. And inside the package was a gift, a little piece of bread, and it was in a little bag. And outside it said, "Happy birthday, happy 6th birthday." That means I was 6 years old. So here is food again. My mother, and I said, "Oh, my mother is alive somewhere." I didn't know where she was. She gave me that bread. So again, the bread is the egg, the bread. It meant life and love. And then one more thing, which I sort of want to say about bread. After we were liberated, the Russians had come, and they started like a soup kitchen, and they baked bread. And I never smelled anything like it. The aroma, my entire time in Auschwitz, we smelled the burning of bodies. This was the smell. The moment you got off the cattle car, I said to my mom, "What is that?" She told me the truth. Those are the burning of bodies. Here I had a new smell, the smell of fresh baked bread. I remember sitting with her. She had each one got a loaf. Each person got a loaf. So she took her loaf, I took my loaf, and we were sitting and we were eating. The connection was so strong. It's like, the idea of breaking bread together. It's very, very, very meaningful. And in the book, I have 2 recipes. I'll tell you later about, should I tell now about the chopped, okay?
We can talk about it later. But there is more to your 6th birthday story. There is a sad ending to that story, because you received that package and...
What happened to the package?
Yes.
My personality still is the same, by the way, that things are not bad. Things are great. I'm saving whatever I have when things get worse. So I don't take aspirin until I'm really sick, because I'm okay. So I got this piece of bread, and I wasn't going to eat it, because my childish vision at the age of 6 was that I saw everybody dying of starvation. That was normal. So I had this picture that I am dying of starvation. I'm just on my last breath, and I take that piece of bread that my mother gave me. That was my life. And I ate it, and I survived. However, I didn't know that bread goes stale. I had no experience with food, and I hid it. And in the middle of the night, rats this size came and ate up my whole bread. I didn't even taste it. My insurance was gone. That was my memory of bread and my mother at that time.
Thank you. I think this is, speaking of mother's love and the relationship with mother, I wanted to go to Eugene for a moment. Speaking of this connection, between love and cooking, the recipes you shared with us for this cookbook are very simple. The book opens up with your recipe, which is a black bread chocolate sandwich. Which is something you ate after the liberation. It was meant to fatten you up. Then another recipe you shared is kogel mogel. I say kogel mogel. I know we say here kogel mogel. It's a raw egg with sugar, again, meant to fatten you up and make you feel better. Then you also share a recipe for potatoes with buttermilk. What they have in common is that they were made by your mother, who was taking care of you after the war, and I was hoping you could tell us a little bit about your special relationship with your mom and what cooking was like when you moved to the U.S., because especially the buttermilk, I like that story you mentioned about the hot summer days.
Well, I was an only child, and so food, I never experienced hunger to the point that, it was driving me crazy. The hunger did not bother me as much. What was the worst experience, because since you mentioned it, was when in a transport to Auschwitz. I was 3 days in a cattle car with my father and with no water. That was much more difficult. Not having water is worse than not having food. And he traded a diamond for 2 bottles of vodka. And so every time I said, I'm thirsty, he gave me a shot and I went to sleep. So I knew how to drink vodka straight. But the recipes that you said about my mother, she was phenomenal because she had personality. Everybody loved her. You met her and you fell in love with her. In fact, I'll tell you a story. Stand-up comedians would come to her in the ghetto and then in Plaszow concentration camp. And they said, Ella, I have to entertain the SS. Tell me 100 jokes. And she would rattle off 100 jokes because she had a near photographic memory. Or the time when she was they were transport, she's part of Schindler's List, my mom. And she was in a transport of the 300 women going to Auschwitz. They were going to Brinica, the Schindler's camp, but they stopped off in Auschwitz. And they stripped them naked, shaved off their hair, all the women. And the women were besides themselves. Some were hanging themselves on any hooks that they could find. They handed my mother a cotton dress, and a short sock and a long sock. And then they gave her the Hollanderki, the wooden shoes from Holland. So she said, she put on the socks, she put on her gloves, she used them as gloves on her arms, and she put on the dress, and she slid across the floor, said, ladies, this is autumn fashion 1944. So they knew her that she was a fashion plate, so they started to laugh, and then nobody wanted to commit suicide anymore. He says, that was it. So she had a very positive outlook, and she was just terrific. And the recipe was that I have the first one in the cookbook, which is black bread with butter and shaved chocolate over it, was a matter of necessity because we didn't have very many things to eat. And that's one thing that appealed to me. And I was so skinny, you could see through me with a 100-watt bulb. You didn't need an X-ray machine. So that's...
You had big ears. You always mentioned.
Excuse me?
You always mentioned when we talked that you had big ears.
Oh yeah, well, yeah. The big ears because I was so famished.
Yeah. Michael.
Yes, that's me.
Yes. Speaking of mothers, from everything your mother Sophie used to cook, you chose to share with me the sweet Nudelkugel recipe that I enjoyed very much. It's delicious. But it's a recipe that was recreated by your family, correct? It was something that you tried to sort of recapture the flavor, and after many attempts, you wrote down the recipe that resembles your mother's recipe.
Yes. Basically, my mother was starving, I was starving, and my daughter tells me about my mother telling the story about finding food and putting it inside her bra, probably similar to you know, what you mentioned, Tova.
I know, I just put it on, I was only 6.
Oh, you didn't have a bra?
I put it under my little shirt.
Oh. But, my mother actually shows us her forehead. She was beaten over the head coming into the children's bunk to share some of her bread with me. And, but basically, over time, my wife Judy and my kids came up with a noodle kugel that we all love. It's dairy, but we're not Orthodox, so we have milchadik and fleischadik. I mentioned that to someone today, and we do mix dairy and meat, and we love the noodle kugel because it actually it does remind me of my mother because she was starving all the time, and here we're enjoying food and celebrating.
Thank you. Rosalie? You were 12 years old when your family was taken to Auschwitz.
Yes.
And on the day of the arrival, your mother and your younger brother were killed.
Correct.
On that day. And you and your 4 sisters survived. You survived together, and I want you to talk a little bit about this, but during one of our conversations, you said, I quote, "If I ever survive this hell," that you said that when you were in Auschwitz, you used to think, if I ever survive this hell, all I would want in my life is enough potatoes. I would never ask for anything else. And I know that food and bread had a tremendous meaning to you during the war and to your story actually of survival, but you also admit that now your relationship with food and eating is very positive, and you consider eating and cooking as an act of celebration, survival, and resistance. And you mentioned that food and cooking can also be deeply healing, especially by staying connected to the loved ones who are no longer with us. I would like you to tell us a little bit more about what cooking and food meant to you after the war, and how did you stay connected to the memory of your mother and to your brother?
First of all, I want to say that upon arrival to Auschwitz, I was separated from my sisters, and I was sent with my mother, where an announcement came on the loudspeaker and said, "Those of you that are going to the left will receive more bread." So, being that I was sent to the left with my mother and my sisters were sent to the right, I decided to run back and get my sisters so we should be together and have more food. So I ran to the right to get my sisters. I did find them, but they wouldn't let me go back. Once I was there, I was forced to stay there. And certainly I was devastated for leaving my mother. And it just so happens that because I did that, I'm here today. Because they went straight to the gas chamber. I found out later that my little brother was also taken away from my father and sent to the gas chamber. And he wound up in the gas chamber without any family around him and all by himself. I mean, all strangers, and that really is a pain which will last forever. Anyway, being in Auschwitz, I remember lying on the ground, very hungry. We were not allowed to come into the barrack, so we laid there without food or water. My lips were blistered from the hot sun, And I thought to myself, I was so hungry. I thought to myself, if I ever survive this war, all I want in my life is to have enough potatoes. I will never ask for anything else. Thank goodness I have enough potatoes. And then some. So the second question is, what is the memory of...
How do you stay connected to the memory of your mom? But if you wanted to...
How do I get connected with the memory of Mom? Every time I make the stuff that she used to make, I think of her. If I make even kugel that you mentioned, she used to do that. And I think of her because she used to make that a lot, and latkes. And every time I make food that she used to make, I think of her. And I'm reminded of my mother.
But you add onions. You add onions to your latkes.
I did.
Yes.
I did.
Thank you.
I think it's better. And also the chopped liver that I put in the book. I'm very frugal with fat. So I put in 3 tablespoons. However, 3 tablespoons is really not enough. So if you make chopped liver, put a little more oil in the sauteed onions.
Rosalie, now you're telling me.
I realized it. So, put a little more oil in the sauteed onions, and then grind it.
Thank you. Tova, your mother survived the war, but she never recovered from the trauma of Auschwitz. And in a sense, you had to mother her and then reparent yourself. And I was wondering, among the recipes you shared with me for this cookbook are tsimes and kasha verniškes. I love the kasha verniškes recipe. I love it. But I know from our conversations that there is another recipe that is not included in the book and that holds a special meaning and is sort of illustrates that complicated relationship you had with your mom when you had to take care of her when you moved to the US, and it's the gefilte vision. Can you talk to us about this?
I just want to say it's wonderful to hear these stories because each of those stories resonates with the rest of us because we went through the same thing a little bit differently, but it was very, very much the same. I just want to say one thing before I go to after the war. My mother was, she knew that we would be separated. Eventually, kids didn't stay together with their parents very long. So she taught me rules. One of the rules that I remember, she said to me, you're going to get a tin cup and a bowl, which I had, and a spoon. Don't ever, ever lose it because you will not get a second one. And there was a rule in Auschwitz that if you didn't have your cup, you wouldn't get the food. So what did people do? They would steal those cups so they could go twice. And the person who gave out the food only saw the cup, didn't look at the person because you weren't a person. You were just a number or something. So I remember I was constantly worried that I'm going to lose that cup. But at 5.5, I learned so well that I hid it in certain areas. I never lost my cup or my spoon. So it's interesting how food was constantly in our minds, constantly. And before they took you to the gas chamber for children, I have to talk about children, I don't know adults, they would give you a very wonderful meal. It was something sweet, something warm, something soft. It was like some kind of a porridge. And you'll have to read the rest in my book. This is not in the cookbook. Other things are in the cookbook. This is not part of it. But I remember saying to myself, I know we're going to the gas chamber. All the kids, by the way, we were 6.5 by then, 6.5. Oh, we know, but we didn't care. We were going to get something to eat. Food was so immediate that whatever happened 2 hours later, if you eat now, that's all it was. So I just wanted to tell you just part of it, because I didn't realize until I came to this meetings how food played such an indelible role in everybody. Doesn't matter what age you are. So after the war, my mother never recuperated. She was very strong during the war. She fell apart afterwards, because when she realized that she lost all her brothers and sisters, 150 people, she was one person left, the only person left from her entire family. And she saved me, and by luck, my father was in Dachau, and he was also saved. But we lived in Brooklyn, and every Thursday, she made the gefilte fish. It's not in the book. I don't even have the recipe. All I know is she would use a wooden bowl and we call that a hakmesse in Yiddish. It's like a knife, like a round with a round bottom. And you think, well, she developed cancer, and one of her hands arm became very swollen. Her right arm that she used for making the fish, and she couldn't do it. So at 12 and a half, that was my job. Every week, she put the fish in, and I was doing all the chopping, and she was adding the sugar and the salt and the onions and the carrots, whatever the recipe. And as I am chopping, it took about an hour, because I don't know if we didn't have any grinder, or she wanted a certain consistency. You know, I didn't ask that. And I'm chopping. And with the rhythm of the chopping, she began to talk about her family. And she talked about the Shabbat that she used to have with her mother, her brothers, her sisters, her nephews. They were all gone. They were all gone. They were all ashes by then. But that's what she did. And every single Thursday, because you cook it Thursday, Friday is better than the next day, always best the next day. So she would do, and then she had me taste it, so I know the flavor. And she said to me, don't swallow it, because you'll get worms. You're not allowed to eat raw fish. She didn't know about sushi, of course. So one thing I'm very sorry about, because I did it automatically, I had to do that, I didn't hear her stories enough. We did it for 5 years until she died. She was 45, I was 18, but I still have a bowl like that. I don't know where it is. I have to ask my daughter where my bowl is. My daughter is here. And the chopping, and the constant chopping and tasting it. So I have no recipe. I know how it's supposed to taste and how to cook it. So food evoked in her home. And she was relaxed. It wasn't a sad story. They weren't around anymore, but her eyes, we weren't in Brooklyn, Pitkin Avenue, where we lived anymore. We were back in the town on Shabbat, making dinner for the family. And that's very, very memorable for me.
Thank you, Tova. Eugene, during one of our conversations, you said, I quote, "After the war, we ate to live, not lived to eat. The fact that we were together was more important to me than what was put on the table." And this feeling of togetherness and being reunited with your parents carried a special meaning, because you, in a sense, lost your parents twice, as you say. Can you share with us a little bit about what your parents went through? And I always really enjoy when you talk about their life in Krakow before the war, the stories they shared with you about the Jewish community in Krakow. You paint such a vivid picture, so maybe you can take us back a little bit to pre-war Krakow, and then tell us about, you mentioned your mother was saved by Schindler, but maybe you can also talk a little bit about how your father survived.
The Jewish community in Krakow, they put a tithe on themselves. They paid the taxes to the state, and they took 10% of their income, they put it into a fund, and they took care of all the Jewish things. So they had a Jewish orphanage, they had Jewish soup kitchens and clinics, and it was all paid for by Jewish money. So the Gentiles couldn't say that a bunch of freeloaders, so in creating any kind of friction. My father was a very successful businessman. So he said the honor of that was that he not only gave 10%, but at the end of the year, it was always short, so they had to give more. And he wound up, he put up the A roof for Krakow, which is a wire around the city. So because of it, and without any repercussion and no anti-Semitism over it, every rabbi in Krakow came to his wedding when he married my mom as an honor that they came to at his wedding. So he was very talented. When I was 6 months old when the war broke out, we owned our own apartment house. And we had a double apartment in the penthouse, and we had maid. And Germans came in one day, a colonel, and said, "This is a very nice apartment, it's mine, get out." So the next morning, we left for the ghetto. We put my stuff in a baby carriage, and me, and we wound up and my father, because he was perfect in German and Polish, and he understood French, and so he was the private secretary to Amon Get, the psychopath.
Who's also featured in the Schindler's List.
And
yes.
just to look at him, you would get chills, because he was 6'8" and weighed 275 pounds. In the movie Schindler's List, he's played by Fiennes, who's a normal person, but he liked to kill people. And one day he was, when he walked into the office, my father stood up at attention, and he bashed him in the face. And blood was coming out of his mouth, and teeth were falling out, and it's when he took out his Luger and put it to his head. And my father said, "What's the reason for this?" He says, "I told you 3 days ago that I wanted a certain report." And he says, "That report's been on your desk for 3 days. You covered it up." And he went over to the desk and shut it. So the commandant put his arm around him and says, "Bist ein guter Kerl. You're a good fellow." But he had taught himself not to be afraid during the incident, but later on he would shake like a leaf. So, and before the war, I only thought that my mother her job was to take care of me, to dress me and to take me for walks, and and watch me eat, and and put me to bed. And then she worked for Oskar Schindler in the Amalia factory, and she's on Schindler's List, the 300 women that transport. And what it was, my father was able to hide me. He told me when to hide, and I hid. And when they had all the segregatia, when they take all the kids out and send them to Auschwitz, and Auschwitz is 55 minutes by car on a single-lane road from Krakow to Auschwitz. And they rounded me up and other boys, and they were sending us to Auschwitz to be gassed. And my father came out of line, and he said, "Permission to die with my son." So the commandant said, "Permission granted." So then other fathers stepped forward and said, "Permission to die with my son also." And so there's still a transport of fathers and sons. It was put in a cattle car, but it took 3 days to get to Auschwitz. 2 weeks, excuse me. 2 weeks. And that was the mazel. So we came late. When we got to Auschwitz, we were in pretty sad shape. And so Mengele saw us, and he said, "Weg mit den Haufen." That means take that garbage away. So they marched us right to the gas chamber. Halfway to the gas chamber, he got an officer and handed him a letter. And he read the letter, and he said, "Halt, about face." And that's when they tattooed me, and they put me into the general population. And it turned out that the Russians were so close, because we had delayed 2 weeks in the 55-minute ride. So the Russians were so close, they had orders from Berlin to only burn the dead, but not to gas any more fresh ones. So that was what saved me. But again, it was, in the Kinderlager, but I had a skill in the Kinderlager. Other boys would come up to me and say, which shoe do I put on? Which one is my left and which is my right? They didn't know. I could figure it out. So that was my skill.
Thank you. Michael, I know you brought something with you that you brought two things you wanted to talk about, and I was hoping maybe you could share the story. Yes.
The Kiddush cup.
Yeah.
It's featured in the cookbook. There's a beautiful photo, yeah. But you also brought the watch. Maybe could you share the story behind these two objects?
Yes. My father was actually president of the Judenrat, which is a go-between the Nazis and the Jewish people. But so based on documents, he saved a lot of Jewish people. But at the end, in the town we were in Żarki, Poland, which is south of Częstochowa, we saw what was happening, and my mother and my father made a makeshift vault in the back of the house, as a lot of other Jewish people did. And they buried jewels, they buried money, and a lot of other things. My mother came back from Austria. She was packing bullets, and she came back, and the house was taken over by people and couldn't get into the house. But in the middle of the night, she snuck in. She was digging with her hands. Her hands were actually bleeding to find that makeshift vault. And everything had been stolen except one thing, which is this Kiddush cup. It's a cup that is used to make blessings on the Sabbath. And so even though it doesn't look like much, it has dings in it, it's been used for our wedding, our children's weddings, bar mitzvahs, bat mitzvahs, and many other happy occasions. So we treasure this cup, and you had it in the book as well. So that really meant a lot. So that's the story of the Kiddush cup.
And I wanted to ask you one follow-up question. You mentioned that war experiences haunted you for many years after the war, and you didn't speak about Auschwitz. You didn't speak about your memories for many, many decades. And actually, you even considered changing your name and getting rid of your tattoo at one point. But then you started speaking about your experience and sharing your testimony. What changed your mind?
Well, there are a few reasons. One, we have 4 children, and I think I'll have to ask my wife, about 12 grandchildren. So one of them, Jake, was speaking at his synagogue, and for a mitzvah project, he asked me if I would talk about the Holocaust and my experiences. And I can't say no to my grandchildren. So I talked, and that's one reason got us started talking. The other thing, my daughter, Debela, and I were going to write a book. It's called Survivors Club, and it's our story about Auschwitz and the Holocaust. And we were looking for that picture of me and Tova and a few others. You might have seen it. It's in museums and so on. We looked up, and it happened to be the Deniers Club. They were saying, these kids don't look so bad. They weren't treated so badly in Auschwitz. And that was enough to just slam the computer down and start talking. And that's another reason why we proceeded with the book, Survivors Club.
Yeah, the image that, Michael, you're referring to, it's a very famous image of children walking out of Auschwitz in between two barbed wires, and you and Tova are next to each other. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, before I do want to open our conversation up for some questions from the audience, but I have one final question, the same question to all of you. When we were together in Auschwitz Birkenau right before the pandemic, January 2020, we sat in front of the infamous Birkenau Gate, and one of the speeches was delivered by a survivor from Poland, Marian Turski, and he spoke about the lessons of Auschwitz, and he said that what he wants people to remember is that Auschwitz did not fall from the sky. And what he meant by that, and it was a very moving speech, what he meant by that was that specific decisions and policies and a socio-political climate and an atmosphere of indifference all played role in creating a system that led to Auschwitz. I want to finish our conversation today asking you about the life lesson or some sort of, maybe more than one, life lesson that you would like to leave behind. If you know, what would you want your children, grandchildren, our grandchildren to remember? So, all of you, starting with Rosalie.
Okay, I urge the young generation to be upstanders and fight against intolerance, hate, and prejudice towards all people, regardless of race, color, or religion. So remember that. Be upstanders and fight intolerance and hate and prejudice towards all people. Like I said, regardless of race, color, or religion.
Thank you. Tova? Mm-hmm.
Okay. I agree 100%. But we are now in shul, and I think that the majority here are Jews, although I hope they're non-Jews also, I very much hope. But one of the big things that I feel is that we have to know who we are. We have to be proud of being Jewish, proud of our religion, because one thing they couldn't kill is our Judaism and our hope in Auschwitz. They killed our families, they took away all property, they took away everything we had, but they couldn't kill our minds. And there we had hope. And if you know who you are, you will be here for a long time. What worries me, of course, is this terrible anti-Semitism. But I say it about it that we come from very resilient people. There have been anti-Semitism for generations and generations and years, and it will be more to come, but we will survive, like we have Israel. And so the idea of courage and resiliency as people, very, very important for the young generation, and also to remember. I am very scared that after we're all gone, I mean, after all, we are a certain group, right? Of a certain age. We may not be here 10 years from now, right? Who's going to remember us? And I hope the young people will. That's one of the reasons I wrote the book, The Daughter of Auschwitz, so people can remember us. And one of the things that one of my grandkids did, which made me extremely proud, he put some of my stories on TikTok, and he reached millions of non-Jews. So what we need is for the young people, I love to speak to young people, we need them to help them learn and remember. They have to remember us. Remember us. It's very hard to talk about that. Just the way we remember our parents, we remember our families, you have to remember us. And you have to go on exactly what you said and fight for justice. That's all I have to say.
Michael.
Yes. Basically, one of the things that I learned from Auschwitz and from being with my kids, my family, is optimism. We talk a lot to kids in grade school, in high school, in college, and not every day is a perfect day. My mother gave me this watch, which has Hebrew inscription, a Gimel and a Zion. It stands for Gam Ze Ya'avor, which means this too shall pass. So if you have a bad day, remember, look to the future and be optimistic, and Gam Ze Ya'avor. The other thing that's been extremely important to me is education. The Nazis can take everything, as you said. I was B1148, as I have on my tattoo. I wasn't Michael anymore. But education is critical. And I'm very lucky that we have 4 kids. They're educated. We have 3 of the older ones that are in colleges. And just get as much education as you can. And the third thing, I think, is to stand up. Stand up against injustice, against anti-Semitism, stand up for black people, for Hispanic people, LGBT communities, and because everyone has a right, and cut down on bullies and injustice. So those are basically three things that are important to me.
Thank you, Michael. Eugene.
Well, one of the things I learned is to stay strong and not to forget Auschwitz, but not to forget our journey as Jews for the last 4,000 years. We've seen so many civilizations come and go, and we stayed. At one time we were considered crazy because we prayed to an invisible God who didn't have a name. But we stayed Jews throughout. And we've seen other civilizations fall flat on their face and disappear. So I just say, have faith that tomorrow will be better and our journey will continue on throughout history.
Thank you. So we have some time for questions from the audience. If you're sitting up front, you can walk up to one of the microphones to my right and left. And I think there are also members of the staff with microphones on both of the aisles.
If you have any question, if you can please stand up and come to the microphone. Don't be shy. Okay? Please. Thank you.
Hi, thank you all so much for sharing, and everything that you had said is so meaningful. But I'm curious to know, because you survived very young, my mother also survived Auschwitz, but I had found when I was growing up, she felt very different from the Jewish Americans, and it really had an effect on her. And I'm curious to know, were you growing up as coming here to America and being so young and having survived Auschwitz and having these stories, did you feel, being with American kids that were born here, that you were different? Or had different experiences, or it had an effect on you?
Answer that. I went to a very good grade school, PS6 in Manhattan. Oh, can you hear me now? I went to a very good grade school, PS6 in Manhattan, and basically I didn't have the right clothes. Everyone was dressed well. I had tattered clothes. I didn't speak the language. I came here hardly speaking any English. And then there was a reunion of PS6, I don't know, 50 years, whatever later. And I was there, and the kids were saying they feel so bad that they didn't acknowledge me. The teacher didn't say anything about having a tattoo on my hand. And all of a sudden, they were my best friends. So I hope that if you have kids, that they learn to be kind and considerate to other people. If they look different, they don't speak the language, or whatever the differences are. And I think that's extremely, extremely important.
Did you want to add anything, Rosalie? What was the question?
You know, I'm sorry to say, but I don't even know the question. You told me, but I didn't hear.
Did you feel different when you said the... Go ahead, Tova.
Yeah.
Did you feel different? No. When you moved to the US from either Jewish Americans who didn't have you don't have to.
Yeah.
I'm curious if I should ask a question or if you're going to answer. Sorry.
I felt different when we moved to the United States. I didn't know the language, and I think that the American Jewish population kind of looked down on us with the grine. And they showed us how to put on electricity and the lights, and like we came out of the wilderness or something. So they treated us like we are less than them. But we learned, we accepted whatever it was.
It's interesting. When I was tattooed by a very young girl. Now I look at her young. She was old to me then. I was 5.5. She was about 18, Jewish woman. And this is what she said to me after she finished tattooing. She said to me, I gave you a very neat number. If you survive, get yourself a long shirt so nobody would see it and you won't be embarrassed. Years forward, I come to America. I am 11 and a half years old, and I go to school in Astoria, Queens. And the teacher looks at my name. It's a Polish name. She doesn't like it, so we have to change it. And then she makes me cut my hair, my braids, to look more American. But those are her words. Wear a long shirt. We don't want to see this tattoo. You have to forget it. It's a new world. You live in a new world right now. Don't talk about it. And I didn't. But it's interesting that it was in two different things. And I said to myself, somebody wanted to take it off. And I said to this doctor who wanted to give me a gift, you don't give a plastic surgery. He said, you won't even miss it. You won't even see a scar. It'll be so small. And I said to him, you know, even if I had it tattooed right on my forehead, I wouldn't do it. Because at that time, I even knew I was a witness. I wanted to be a witness, but nobody listened, right? Nobody heard. Nobody listened. So it was very tough for all of us when we came from this terrible place to here, where they wanted to Americanize it 24 hours. They gave me a name, Susan. Every time somebody called Susan, I didn't answer.
Before we take the last question for the night, I wanted to thank all of you for coming. You really touched our hearts. We appreciate the book. We appreciate you. Purchasing the book is a donation to the foundation. We have a few left outside. Feel free to purchase. Last question of the night. Thank you very much for joining us tonight, and thank you again.
So I am the grandchild of survivors who met inside the camps, and I don't know if there are anybody else here who's second generation or third generation. If you are, please raise your hands. But it just, Tova, your comment about memory really moved me, because that's, I think, it falls on all of us, but especially the descendants of survivors, to tell these stories and keep them alive, especially at this time. And so, you're not going to be forgotten. This is not ending at this generation. So that's the first thing, and I think my question, and the food obviously tells so much of the story of your parents, but for each of you, if there's just like one thing that you would want like us to know about your parents, like something about their personality or their humor or something that they will, just to keep their memory alive.
About my mother? One thing that we should know about our parents?
Yes. Well, let me just mention to you that my mother loved to sing and dance, and we would come to synagogue, and she would just belt out her voice. She had, in my mind, a good voice. And so I remember that, and she loved to sing Yiddish songs. I was talking to someone, and Yiddish was my mama lashon. If some of you know what that is, it was my mother's tongue. She didn't speak much English. She moved to Havana, Cuba, because I lost my father and my brother, and my aunt couldn't come into the U.S., so she was in Cuba, and she introduced my mother to someone, but she spoke Yiddish, and and that's really the language we conversed in. So that's one thing I remember about my mother. She just loved to sing songs that she knew.
Thank you, Michael. Tova, yes.
I think that what impresses me as a woman, and a mother, and a mother and a grandmother, courage. I don't know if I could have that kind of courage that my mother had. Courage under the worst times. She parented me, taught me, talked to me, explained to me during the worst circumstances. I don't know if I could do that. I am just amazed. In fact, all of us spoke about our mothers, all of us. Our mothers were the saviors and the role models that I wish I bet many of you think you couldn't do it. I bet you could have also, if you had to.
Thank you. Rosalie?
Well, I realize now how hard my mother worked. I was the youngest, and the oldest was 8. And there were 6 children between 1 and 8. There were no electrical appliances. She had to wash by hand. And got up 4 o'clock in the morning and started to make a fire and start baking bread. And it was, I didn't know as a child how hard she really worked. And she did everything with love and was a very good mother. And she had a tough life, because my father was away most of the time on business, and she was left with 6 children and doing all the work. So I appreciate it now. And I really respect her for who she was. And I loved her. And what happened to her at the end is heartbreaking, heartbreaking, to wind up in the gas chamber after all this. Okay.
My father was a very good-looking young man, and he was walking down the street, and he saw his sister at a cafe talking to my mother. So he asked her sister to introduce them, and he said, "I spoke to your mother for 15 minutes, and I knew she was going to be my wife." And he did everything for her. And, you know, he proposed to her, and first time he was with her, and she said "I can see that you're a mental case." So, but he won her over eventually, and she was always the center of our existence, my mom, and I'm very proud of the fact that I'm the product of that love.
Thank you, everybody, for coming to hear us talk. Thank you for sharing your stories.